Okay, so today we'll be setting up a VRIK player with all the Hurricane components. And the first thing you want to do is make sure that each finger has a tip object on the very last bone, and you want to make sure that that tip object is placed at the end of the fingertip. And then we just add two components here to the hand root, physics poser, and the posable hand. The posable hand component is what holds the hand transform information for all of the bones. And then all you need to do here is assign the root of each finger and the tip for that finger. And then you'll notice that there's a is left toggle, and since I'm working on the left hand, shortly here I'll be checkboxing the is left. And here we go, checking the box. And then once you're done, we can press set up fingers, and it's going to populate this array, and you can just verify that all the bones have been set. And now we just move over to the right hand root, and we'll do the same exact thing, adding the posable hand and then adding the physics poser. This time not checking the is left box. And then once you're done, press set up fingers and quickly check that all the bones have been populated in the array. And there's another quick check to make sure that your tips are placed at the end of the finger. Next we'll be adding a hand animator and a hand poser component. So I've selected both hands here so I can add them at the same time. So the HVR hand poser and the HVR hand animator. The hand poser is a component that holds the pose information for when you're not holding something. We'll set that up later. Here we want to uncheck pose, position, and rotation, and then assign the three component fields from the same components that are on the same object. And then repeat the process for the right hand, uncheck pose, position, and rotation, and assign the three fields from the same object. Then we'll come down and right click in the project, right click HurricaneVR mirror settings, and we'll assign them to the left hand and the right hand posable hand component. Here I only need one because the mirror settings are the same for both left and right hand. But your character may need two depending on the mirror settings required for mirroring poses. And then we go ahead and add the VRIK component to the pilot root, and we create the prefab now, and then we'll also create a prefab variant which will be used for the posing system. So immediately create a prefab variant, and then on the variant, so go ahead and open up your variant, and we'll need to scroll down to the spine and turn off position weight and rotation weight, so that way it doesn't affect the body while you're posing it. Then two more components, HVR IK targets and HVR editor IK. These help you manipulate the IK targets in the scene window while you're posing. Then we want to find our HVR settings, scriptable object, and then we want to make sure that the open hand pose field is emptied. And then we're going to assign the prefab variant that we just created to the full body field slot. next is probably the hardest part of the entire process, trying to find out the mirror behavior between left and right to left. Luckily for the pilot, finding one bone's mirror behavior, it applied to the entire hand on both sides. So essentially, to complete this process, I would pick, say, the thumb root on both hands. I would lock them in the inspector so I can easily see them. And then, starting with the position XYZ, the rotation XYZ, I would simply see what is the behavior from left to right when both hands are visually mirrored. So we can see right now that the thumb X and on both sides, positionally, they have the same sign, same value. Same for Y, but the Z position is opposite. So negative 0.03 compared to 0.03. And then I would do the same thing for the rotation. I can see that the thumb X rotation is opposite of each other. The Y is opposite of each other, negative 70 to 70. The Z is the same, negative 95 to negative 95. And then you can mark this in the scriptable object. And you can mark them per finger or per bone in the event that the entire finger doesn't have the same settings. And from what I've found is that the non-thumb fingers generally have the same setting, so you can most likely focus on one bone on a non-thumb finger, and that should probably apply to all the non-thumb bones. And then you might just need to find the thumb root, which may be different just depending on how your character was modeled. So here I'm doing the same thing for the right thumb second bone. The values and the inspector started at 0, so I can't tell what the behavior is. So now I'm just doing something goofy in the editor, just trying to visually mirror them, and then I can see their behavior. And luckily for the pilot, again, they all had the same values. So you can pretty much just try to find the thumb root bone and then one of the, say, index finger root, and use those settings to start with. And when you start posing, it should be evident that your mirror settings are not working. But just to save time, I would suggest try just the thumb root bone and then one bone from the other fingers and reusing those settings. And then if you see in the middle inspector now, you can see the thumb settings has size 3. I actually only needed one setting for the whole finger, but just for demonstration purposes, I reused the same setting 3 times. The next thing we're going to do, once the pose mirror settings have been completed, is with a dummy object in the scene, we add a HVR hand poser object. And then if you watch the other tutorial on setting up the pose for a grabbable, it should be similar. The only difference now is that you have a full body being posed with the in-editor IK updates. And here, just creating a relaxed pose, which will be used by the hand when you're not holding something. I kind of just left it as the default hand just for demonstration purposes, but you might want to pose your relaxed hand differently. So once you have your fingers the way you want them, the position doesn't matter. Just go ahead and save a relaxed pose. And then you want to create 2 more poses. One is going to be a opened pancake, like wide open hand pose. So here I'm just posing a really wide open hand. And this wide open hand pose is used for the dynamic poser. When you're about to grab something, the hand opens really wide to be able to get a nice dynamic grab. And then now I'll just fast forward until this is done. And once you're satisfied with how your hand looks, you can go over to the other side and mirror it from left to right or right to left, depending. And then just go ahead and save this pose, save as. call it wide open hand or whatever you want to call it. Here I just call it tutorial pilot wide open hand. And then now you want to pose a fist. So I'll fast forward while I pose into a fist. Alright, once you have a nice little fist there, you can mirror it to the other side, press save as, and save as fist pose. Now that we have our poses set up, we're going to start assigning them. So the left hand, we find the physics poser, and we're going to assign the wide open hand pose to the open pose field. And then we're going to assign the grip fist pose to the closed pose field. And then I already have this added, but you can see that there's a palm transform. So you want to make sure that's a child of your hand. And you want it to be dead center of your palm, perpendicular. The Z-axis is pointing out of your palm. And this is just used to aim your hand when you're grabbing something dynamically. Next thing you want to do is check draw spheres and draw tips. And then now you want to just verify that your tips are where you want them to be. They're the pink, purplish sphere. So here I just spend a second to fix the location of my tips because they were off just a little bit. And then you can also decide how many iterations you want the physics poser to go through, or perhaps how many spheres per bone you want to go through, or do you only want the fingertip to be part of the collision detection. That's all settings on the physics poser by default. I believe it's 100 iterations and 3 per bone. Making sure to press setup afterwards. And then we'll go ahead and set up the default hand poser. So we'll assign the relaxed hand pose to the primary slot. And then we press add to add a secondary pose. And then we'll add the grip as the secondary pose. And then we'll slide the thumb down to 0 and make sure the finger curls are all set to close. That way the finger tracking will bend our fingers to the closed pose. And then we'll just repeat the same process for the right hand, assigning the open and closed pose for the physics poser. And once again, making sure you have a palm transform object as a child of your hand. Kind of slide it over, make sure it's in the middle of your palm, Z facing out perpendicular to your palm. And then this might be what it looks like if you have your tips in the wrong place. I had duplicated them and copied them over so they were all in the same place. So now I'm just moving each tip to where they're supposed to go. And then once you have all of your tips oriented and you press setup and kind of move your mouse over the scene window so that it redraws, you'll see that your spheres are now in the correct place. The tip kind of controls where the spheres end up on the last bone. That's why they need to be at the very end. And then again, decide how many iterations you want to do and raise per bone, or whether or not you want to have fingertip only or not to save on processing. And then once you're satisfied with your settings, go ahead and you can disable the debug draw. And then again, for the right hand, we just set the primary pose slot to be the relaxed hand pose that you set up earlier. And then pressing add to add a secondary pose, selecting the secondary slot. And then we can add the fist and moving the thumb to 0 and making sure finger curls are set to close. And then make sure you save your prefab. And then if everything is set up correctly so far, we just want to hop in and then you can just test out the finger tracking and make sure that your hand animator and your hand poser is bending the fingers appropriately for your touch controls or your index controller, depending on which controller you're using. Now we begin setting up the rig. So you can just reuse the current rig new from the framework and unpack it. And now we just need to add 2 objects to each hand. One is going to be the IK target for VRIK, and then we'll have another object for the hand colliders. Since the colliders cannot be on the model, since it's driven by IK, we need to have colliders that will be children of the rigid bodies, which is left hand and right hand, and we'll add those colliders later. And then you can make your IK object a child of the rig, and then we just go ahead and add a IK target onto the camera as well. And then we assign the IK targets to the VRIK component. And here I'm going to reset the pilot's position to 0 so that it's reset under the rig. And then what we need to do is go into play mode and find the position and rotation of our left and right IK targets. So I left the hand model on the default hand on purpose, so that way we can kind of use it as a guide. So here you just want to choose either your left or right hand and start positioning it and rotating it to whatever looks good to you. You can use the hand model as a guide, or you can use your own hand as a guide. That's up to you. And then once you have it in a good place, you can copy the transform while you're in play mode and then paste those values back out after you exit play mode. And then we want to just hop right back in and do the same thing for the opposite hand. And you can see I was kind of wrestling with it because I was reaching the end of the IK arm length. So just keep that in mind. And once you're satisfied with the default position and rotation, again, copy in play mode, exit play mode, and paste the values. Now you need to copy the head position from the bone hierarchy onto the camera. That way you can get the position and rotation values. And we copy those over to the camera IK target. And then you want to hop into play mode and have your camera gizmo on, and then move your camera IK target kind of down and behind. That way your camera is kind of sitting where the eyes should be. So here I'm kind of holding up my headset with my left hand, trying to keep it level while I'm adjusting the transform. And then once you think it looks good, copy the component, exit, and paste. And then there's no need for the neck head component or your copied head from the bone hierarchy anymore, so you can go ahead and clean that up. And now we no longer need the hand, so we can delete the hand models, and the invisible hand is no longer needed because we will use the hand collision colliders instead. And this is where we populate a few of the components that we created earlier on the left hand and right hand. So we just look for left hand here, and then we're going to populate the hand animator component slot, and then the physics poser component slot, and then the hand model field is then populated with the IK target instead of the hand model, which was there before. And then I have a habit of locking the inspector. It's a little useful in case you misclick. And then I just populate the same things: the right hand animator, the physics poser, and then the right IK target into the hand model field. Then we want to make sure that inverse kinematics is checked on the right hand, and then I go back to the left hand because I forgot earlier, and then I check that as well. Next, you want to set up colliders on your hand. Since you can no longer put colliders on your actual hand model, since they need to be on the rigid body. I'm cheating here a little bit because I had already had this set up. But essentially, whatever collision shape you want on your hand, you need to shape it and hop into play mode and kind of position it based on where the hand model is. Here I'm kind of just reusing values that I had found before. So here I'm just hopping in play mode and just verifying that the collider is actually where my hand is. Kind of bonework style, they use a box collider and a sphere collider for the wrist. Their box collider actually shrinks as you grab, but that's currently not a built-in thing. So then just repeat for the left hand, adding colliders that you want on your hand, and then you should hop into play mode and shape them and reorient and position them so that they make sense with where your hand is. So here I'm just verifying that my collider kind of matches where the hand is, and it's good enough for demonstration purpose. And then we want to find the hand physics component and put the hand collision parent into the physics hand filled slot. And this component is what is used to disable collision with the item whenever you're grabbing it. And eventually will help you disable collision with your other hand so that they don't hit each other when you're grabbing two-handed grabs, which is coming soon. The last thing to do is fallback posers on each hand. Here I just use the grip. This is the fallback poser, which is kind of used for the offset pose grab type, or if there are no valid poses found on an object. You kind of have like a fallback grip. And then if everything was set up correctly, you can hop into the game and check. The finger tracking is working. The dynamic grab is working like it should. Static poses that I had pre-set up on these objects are working. Yeah, and everything seems to work okay. The line grab seems okay. And that about wraps it up for setting up a VRIK model with the posing system and grab system.